Here we are here, Carlo Pastore, your neighborhood Commodorian. Today we are going to talk about what is one of my workhorses of Commodore collecting, and also for in-depth research regarding its history, the famous Commodore XXV. This prototype did so much talking, and it would have been a Commodore long awaited as a successor to the mythical Commodore XUltra, but we all know that it was never put on the commercially. Then the Commodore XX5 was born as a project in 1187. Then when Commodore management thought of giving a successor to the Commodore 550, which albeit still had great sales, after the half-hearted misstep of the Commodore, they ate the machine, which I liked very much, but basically employed at that time only in Vesify emulation, i.e. with the famous basic Go Vesify command, had not given a real continuity to the Commodore Vesify, because the Commodore X8 did not actually have software houses that sufficiently developed for the native X8 mode. So most of the Commodore K6 owners, as I said earlier, actually what they were doing, they were using the Commodore K6 in Vispistef mode, and yet it was a machine to push up to 2 megahertz and a Z80 processor to complement that ran the CPM operating system, and the plus 128 KB of RAM, a considerable amount of RAM for 1985 when it was put on the market now. So in the 1987 was born the idea in the middle of the 16-bit era, Mica, to give further continuity to the 8-bit line of Commodore. So the low-end line with the Commodore XX5. Certainly compatibility had to be preserved with the Commodore 24, but this compatibility could not be 100% because otherwise evolved features of the machine could not be developed. So when the machine was completed, compatibility would be around 70% with the old programs. However, certainly the software park of the Commodore 85 was so enormous that therefore one would certainly have been able to have a good supply of titles and programs for office and educational purposes. At that time, the Commodore XFV made use of a XXVX microprocessor developed by Vitor Andrade, an engineer who later went to work in AMD at the conclusion of his Commodore adventure and to develop the K-Satron, and the XXVX was a processor derived from the XXV02, of which very few prototypes are known, and it had a 3.54 megahertz clock assisted by a graphics processor called the BIL. The microprocessors had code names, and the XXVX processor on the Commodore XXVX board is named as Vitor. Instead, the XXVX is named as BIL, a graphics processor very, let's say, ahead of its time, that could also achieve resolutions of 1280 by 400 pixels with 4 colors on the screen. Sympathetically, Amiga engineers were being deluged by the group of engineers working on the Commodore XXVX because even their video processor could be capable of even higher resolutions than the native Amiga. These two microprocessors were aided by a controller called D-Magic. This chip had the function of moving large blocks of memory and thus also the ability to move large images on the screen would have been very useful in the design of high-resolution, high-speed video games. All of this was aided by 128 KB of onboard RAM on the motherboard, and there was a possibility of a trapdoor located on the belly of the computer at the bottom that housed up to 8 megabytes of memory expansion. Only 1 megabyte of memory expansion was designed as a prototype for this machine, and also obviously never put on the market. The machine had a floppy disk inside the 3.5-inch shell. The floppy disk can be seen in the front of the computer, and this floppy disk was a floppy disk that had its own microcontroller on the motherboard. An external drive called the Commodore Quartus 15 was planned and designed, which rested for its logic on the microprocessor on the motherboard of the Commodore Quartus. This machine you see before you was a prototype of the prototype. Basically, it was a pre-release of the Commodore Quartus Vive, because he was the only pre-production batch, the only prototypes that are developed and were developed in the number of 205 shipped to the various Commodore locations were absolutely revision IIB. This is an unmarked unit with a label. Those instead were a label on the underside, and you can see on the top right here above the floppy disk drive a piece of tape with characters written in Chinese where it says "don't correct." Evidently I had it translated by a professional translator, and evidently "don't correct" means that this was a unit ready to do the first pre-production batch. So at this point, the excitement leads us towards turning on the prototype, turning on this mythical Commodore XXXV. We go to turn on this Commodore XXXV S monitor, suitable for RGB output. Basically, the Commodore XXXV had as a prototype only this type of new pole output enabled. The RF was present on the motherboard, but it was not working. And here it is. Here, you cameraman, please, let's turn on the powders. Here it is. Here it is to you in all its glory. You can see Commodore XXXV, the very open system, because the ROM still was not complete. The ROM version is this one you see initialed, but basically complete ROM versions do not exist. Or rather, they were only completed when the project was cancelled in January 1991, because Commodore management had seen that the project still at Christmas 1999 was not ready to be commercialized. And so, alas, they replaced the Commodore XXXV coming out at Christmas 1999 with the infamous Commodore XXXVGS, a total disaster. A console version of a hardware of 1982 at a time, when consoles with more already prevailed, could only be a big flop. You can see, let's see if I can show you, since I don't remember exactly what are the commands that were not implemented, but there are some commands that were not implemented. And so let's see if if we can do it to write it down, because I wanted to show you simply that the computer writes when not the command doesn't have the counterpart in ROM. It writes you an implemented command error. So basically, let's see if then, I don't understand why the shift lock stays depressed. Consider, guys, that we are talking about a prototype here of a prototype, incomplete. So with alterations here, it is list, because I have to remind myself that you see an implement command error. I beg to show the keyboard. I have to remember that this computer had at the top the caps lock that was depressed and the shift lock here. So a totally different keyboard than the Commodore U-Santa 4, but certainly more evolved and also more complete. Guys, what can I say? Our journey through the wonders of this prototype closes here. And I hope you enjoy this video, and I invite you to follow the Instagram page of Retro Commodore, which then we renamed as Commodoremania, but it's still us. And to the next video, a dear greeting to all.